It seems that with the release of the much-anticipated Avatar: The Way of Water, the fiery debate around James Cameron's magnum opus remains, with some calling the sequel a phantasmagorical, fully immersive waking dream of a movie, while others liken it to being waterboarded with turquoise cement. Is Avatar: The Way of Water truly so mind-blowingly good? Or is it instead actually so miserably awful? As is usually the case with most things, the truth always lies somewhere in the middle, and in the case of Avatar, we have enough to allow us to try and dissect what makes audiences swing so wildly into either extreme. In this video, I'll be focusing on the glowing accomplishments and the unforgivable flaws that have come to an uproarious climax with the release of the long-awaited sequel, Avatar: The Way of Water, and I'll be going over why the franchise's greatest highs for some people may make up its most damning lows for others. In an effort to provide as clear a discussion as I can, I will be going into full spoilers for both Avatar movies. You have been warned. Avatar's most notable aspect has always been its visuals. The release of the first Avatar all the way back in 2009 marked a breakthrough in what CGI could accomplish in the then modern blockbuster, and the release of its sequel in 2022 continues the same trend of showing off that technological power. Just as the first entry in the series had been in 2009, The Way of Water is a visual spectacle unlike any other. It unleashes the full power of CGI, squeezing out every last drop of what those visual arts can accomplish to deliver some of the most lifelike graphics seen in a movie practically ever. It seamlessly blends live action and CGI in a manner that can make both seem neither jarring nor out of place. There's almost none of that uncanny valley effect that you see in other modern attempts with cheaper CGI budgets. It is instead fully immersive in the strangest, most wonderful way, to the point that it can start to feel confusing. The Way of Water can feel like it bypasses your mind's internal CGI distinguishing alarms, those sensors that sort of beep whenever you encounter something that is clearly CGI in an otherwise live-action movie. At least for me personally, that detection was just completely gone, and I was immersed in a way that I can never usually be in CGI-heavy movies like these. And it's no surprise that James Cameron once again beautifully portrays the unreal but vivid, lively alien beauty of Pandora. It may not be the most original world, but it is definitely colorful, exotic, and oddly realistic. I don't think I've ever heard of any other fictional movie world that literally caused people depression simply due to the fact that they couldn't live in it. The immersive power of Avatar's visuals is nigh undeniable, and it's only gotten better in The Way of Water. Avatar's visual innovations are a nearly undebatable aspect of the franchise, as even detractors of these movies tend to give it credit for its accomplishments in the visual regard. However, despite its more than impressive aesthetic power, many have come to take issue with certain aspects of the new movie's visuals, while others have just found themselves not so impressed. One of the most commonly discussed issues in regards to The Way of Water's visuals lies in the homogeneity of its Na'vi characters. In the words of Robbie Collin of The Telegraph, without wishing to sound like an Avatar racist, it also doesn't help that the Na'vi all look so similar, which means the cast's distinctive screen personas become lost in the pixely wash. And while I don't believe that the actors' performances completely fade away under the weight of their digital blue masks, it's hard to deny that the characters oftentimes become hard to distinguish in the visual blue flurry. Oftentimes, I found myself having difficulty differentiating Jake Sully's many children, and when I could differentiate them, I had trouble remembering who was who and who'd done what. It seems to be an issue many people encountered, and the fact that Cameron decides to introduce so many new characters all in one go doesn't help. And even though I personally believe the movie manages to eventually do an almost decent job of distinguishing its characters on a personality level, it doesn't ever reach a point where that distinction is very valid on a visual level. One other point of contention as far as the visuals is that even though Avatar's CGI is undeniably amazing on a technical level, one simple thing prevents The Way of Water from gaining the same level of visual appreciation that its predecessor did all the way back in 2009. And that is the simple fact that back then it was 2009. When the first Avatar movie came out, this level of technical and visual ingenuity was near unheard of. Avatar's visuals changed the game. It brought a degree of exceptional detail on the level of its setting and characters both, in a time where we were not accustomed to something so technically impressive. It was wholly enchanting and almost like nothing we'd ever seen before, and it commanded this magic that no other CGI blockbuster had done before. It was basically the future of CGI in cinema. And while The Way of Water brings forth an even greater level of visual ingenuity and once again offers a CGI that is arguably greater than most else in the market at the moment, it simply cannot be as impressive as it was in 2009. Back in 2009, such CGI-heavy movies were not as common, and the technical capabilities of digital art hadn't yet become what they are now. The MCU, as we know it today, started off in 2008 with Iron Man. That universe was still in the days of its inception back in 2009. In 2022, we've lived through the era of superhero movies, and according to many, are coming to its end, as more and more people are getting oversaturated with the genre. And it is a genre where CGI is abundantly more common. It's not just commonplace, but almost expected, and is used almost without exception in the dozens of Marvel and DC movies and series that drop throughout the year. And while it is usually leagues below the level that Avatar delivers, with frequent laughable failures by studios that are exhausting and overworking their artists, it's still there. The cinematic market is saturated with visual effects and CGI, or at the very least, it is accustomed to it. It is no longer the marvel that it once was, pun unintended. Simply put, a lot of us just aren't as impressed with these visuals as we once were because they are so much more commonplace now, and because of that, for a lot of people, Avatar: The Way of Water simply can't coast off the awe and success of its visuals alone. The last issue I'm going to discuss in regards to The Way of Water's visuals is probably the most up to personal opinion, but is definitely another point of contention between viewers of the movie. This one doesn't have much reason or justification, it's simply a matter of taste. In short, as we've endlessly discussed, one of Avatar's main draws is its visual appeal. James Cameron has put a lot of work and effort into making Avatar look as good as he pictures it in his mind, while still abiding by the limitations of the technology. When the technology wasn't enough to properly capture the movie the way he wanted, he simply waited for it to catch up. A lot of Avatar's legacy lies in its status as a visual spectacle, and many people watch it simply because of that. Many people are content ignoring what others deem as flaws because they're simply entranced in the beauty of Pandora and the fluid grace of the Na'vi. They watch Avatar purely to enjoy its stunning visuals and to immerse themselves in its beautiful world, and the impressive level of the visuals basically makes up for any other aspect of the movie that to other people may have fallen short. And that's a completely valid viewing experience. Avatar works very hard to deliver this out-of-this-world visual experience, to transport its audiences into its vibrant, luscious jungles and clear, mesmerizing seas. A lot of effort is put into making it a feast for the eyes, so it's only natural that a lot of people would come to see it purely for that aspect. However, many other people just aren't as interested in a movie's visuals. Speaking on a more personal level, my main draw in any movie is always its story. That's what gets my ass into seats. A gripping story with interesting, complex characters. That is my personal preference, and I enjoy it to the cost of everything else. I can ignore bad visuals for the most part if a story manages to grab me, but I can never ignore what I deem to be an underwhelming story, even if the visuals, cinematography, and general visual presentation of a movie manages to wow me. For me, no matter how beautifully presented a piece of media is, that can never make up for a weakness in its story. And that's not to say you're wrong if you like watching movies just for the visual experience, or that I'm wrong for watching movies purely for the story. It's just a matter of preference. But this difference in preference is what makes Avatar not as appealing to me as it is to others. One of Avatar's most defining features is its visuals, and since me and many others are just not that interested in visuals in movies overall, Avatar will naturally not have as great a significance, because such a crucial part of the Avatar experience doesn't really matter to me, and thus I've already lost out on such a major appealing factor of the movie. But speaking of stories and how much they mean to me in a movie, let's make our way into the second part of this video and discuss Avatar's writing, both as a franchise and in The Way of Water in particular. Avatar's writing has been an incredibly fascinating aspect of the movie for me, ever since I saw the first one all the way back in a few days ago. Yes, I didn't watch the original Avatar up until one day before the release of the sequel. That same day, I did a lot of research on the franchise as a whole, into James Cameron, into the movie's world-renowned status but lack of a cultural impact, and into the interesting debates it had sparked. And sure, I'd encountered a lot of the memes before and seen people poking fun, but I had never experienced this spectacle for myself up until then. And when I finally did experience it, it just so happened that, in addition to Cameron's efforts to make something technologically and visually magnificent, I found that his way of storytelling had oddly piqued my interest. Mainly, I found that, from a writing perspective, some of the things that worked best for Avatar for some people were simultaneously other people's biggest gripes with the movie. Let me explain. With the Avatar series, Cameron favors a style of simple, straightforward storytelling. It's clear that the movie promotes first and foremost themes of environmentalism, preservationism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and anti-war in general, and it doesn't shy away from really shining a light on those themes. Cameron hoped to make a movie that, in his words, in the enjoying of it, makes you think a little bit about the way you interact with nature and your fellow man. Avatar's themes and messages are universal, Cameron choosing to tackle problems and notions that all people struggle with, no matter their culture or background. And in order to get these themes across to as wide an audience as possible, Cameron goes with tried and tested tropes. He is laser focused in what he needs and doesn't go above or beyond to change it, but rather tells just enough of a story in order to spark emotion in viewers, with just enough to make that story different from its points of inspiration. It's not very complicated or at all hard to follow, it is instead clear and concise. He tells these straightforward, easy to understand stories that as many people as possible can relate to. It's a method that ensures that the movie can reach as wide an audience as possible and get its message out in the same way. Similarly, its ecological, anti-imperialist themes are expressed in the same direct method. You know what to expect, you know what James Cameron is trying to say, and for the most part, you know how the movie is going to go. I believe that this universality in story and clarity in theme is what allowed the original Avatar to attain the heights that it has, and what allowed it to be viewed by as many people as it has and make the amount of money it did. Cameron was aiming to grab the attention of hardcore sci-fi fans, but at the same time, he felt Avatar could appeal to everyone, and that the film could not afford to have a target demographic. He intended for it to be this far-reaching. And now, with The Way of Water, he has replicated his attempts to tell a wide, easy-to-grasp human story, this time taking his center stage ecological themes to the water, and shifting the emotional weight to the importance of family. However, the issue that arises with this manner of simple storytelling and overt thematic usage is that it risks alienating a large subset of viewers. For many, the straight-shooting storytelling, instead of being clear and easy to swallow, instead comes off primitive and unattractive, and to some even shallow and lazy. Its over-reliance on well-established tropes instead comes off like cheap imitation or outright plagiarism. For those who don't harbor that negative of a view, the story could still come off as simply unappealing, as it feels like it lacks any complexity. The directness of Cameron's methods leave no room for audience interaction or participation. You're just set to receive the story that Cameron has made, and you're given such a narrow room to make your own additions or interpretations of the material. This way, Avatar has effectively eliminated audience interaction. It's robbed viewers of an element of cinema and even art as a whole that is crucial to many. The ability to take this piece of art in your own way, using your own impressions of it, your own thoughts, emotions, interpretations, understanding, and perception. It can feel like Cameron doesn't really give you the chance to really take it all in or really feel it for yourself. You only see and feel what he wants you to. Cameron gives us this incredibly beautiful world, but only allows us to look where he wants us to. He restricts the viewing experience, in a way. To many people, including me, that takes away a major chunk of the movie experience. Moreover, Cameron's constant attempts to spell out every aspect of his movie as far as plot and themes can sometimes give off the impression that he doesn't believe in his audience's ability to pick up on fairly obvious cues. In The Way of Water, towards the end of the movie, Neteyam, Jake's eldest son, dies, indirectly due to the actions committed by his brother Loak. Cameron shows you that Loak bears the guilt and weight of his older brother's death repeatedly through the dialogue and general events that follow. But he doesn't stop there. As his brother dies, we also see the camera focus on Loak gazing upon his own blood-stained hands in horror, because, you know, his older brother's blood is on his hands. It's another way to reassert the notion that he feels guilty. Over-explanation like that is fine when it's done once or twice, but sometimes it becomes so frequent that it feels like Cameron genuinely lacks confidence in his audience's intelligence, and that can feel insulting to many. In a recent press conference, James Cameron said when discussing Avatar, "It is not a film that beats you over the head with its message, but it asks you to feel for the ocean, and then maybe a few people can translate that into action." The issue is that sometimes The Way of Water stops feeling like it's just asking you to feel for the ocean, but instead like it's demanding it. It screams it at you, and sometimes that can feel like it's beating you over the head with it. While the protect nature message that Cameron promotes is incredibly admirable and frankly even necessary, the way he promotes it can feel overbearing. I care for the environment, and I'm sure most of you do as well. I'm not doing nearly as much as James Cameron is, that's for sure, but at the end of the day, I do care. Some of you watching might be neutral on the matter, but unless you're a mustache-twirling oil tycoon, I'm sure you can at least understand the importance of protecting nature and this world that we inhabit. Cameron's message isn't unfamiliar or so bizarre that it would need such a heavy hand to be delivered. It's something most of us know of and can feel the importance of, so Cameron doesn't really need to try very hard to sell us on its importance. This is also where the theory of psychological reactance comes into play. In psychology, psychological reactance is a feeling defined as an unpleasant motivational arousal that emerges when people experience a threat to or loss of their free behaviors. It's basically that negative contrary feeling that we get in reaction to a specific point of view when it's presented in a forceful manner or a manner that we feel threatens our freedom. To put it in simpler terms, imagine you've been meaning to do the dishes at home. 1 minute before you're supposed to get up to do them, your roommate passes you by and tells you to go do the dishes. A lot of the time, our first instinct is to react by getting angry or recoiling. You just stop wanting to do the thing when someone commands you to do it. That's because you feel like you've been robbed of your own say in the matter. It's no longer your choice to go do the dishes, it's instead a choice that someone forced upon you. That is an example of psychological reactance. How does this apply to Avatar? Well, a lot of the time, even if you do care about the environment and preserving it, when Avatar goes and really beats that notion into your head with a lack of subtlety, your first instinct may be to back away. And that is the issue with heavy-handed, forceful messaging. It can unwittingly end up accomplishing an opposite effect of what it intended to do. In Avatar's case, it doesn't help that the movie frequently stresses the evils of humanity to a sometimes unnuanced degree. This is especially true in The Way of Water. Humans are almost exclusively evil and compassionless, and there are very few redeeming qualities amongst them, especially in regards to their colonialist, nature-destroying escapades on Pandora. For that reason, it can come off a tad extreme at times, and that lack of nuance and perspective can increase the kind of forceful nature of the message delivery, which may subsequently increase that psychological reactance in viewers. In conclusion, for many, a subtler, more nuanced approach to these environmentalist themes may be far more effective at getting Cameron's ecological messages across. But it's also understandable that Cameron would choose to make these messages as straight up as possible, given that he aims to appeal to mass audiences everywhere, and it's always safer to be more obvious to ensure that you accomplish that. So, as I said before, I believe that this directness, clarity, and overtness in story and themes may be spurning potential viewers who would prefer a deeper, more complex plot. However, from what I've seen, it seems that a greater number of people have taken issue with Cameron's method of storytelling in The Way of Water than they did with the original Avatar. And I think that the reason for that in this long-awaited sequel is because on top of this simplicity in story, the movie is riddled with plot holes. If you want to deliver a fairly common, straight-to-the-point story, you need to at least ensure that your delivery of that story is tight and well put together. In Avatar: The Way of Water, that doesn't seem to be the case, as the story is riddled with major plot holes that are frankly unforgivable for a movie of this scale. Now, those viewers who came to see your movie for the plot recoil even more. They're pushed further away, because even if they choose to give this manner of storytelling a chance, their viewing experience is bogged down by frequent glaring errors. This resonating emotional experience that Cameron seeks to instill in viewers fails to land as a result of a failure in immersion. It's hard for a movie to make you feel when obvious mistakes in the story keep taking you out of it. The Avatar franchise as a whole had a weird development process. In regards to the writing in particular, Cameron basically assembled a writer's room of him, Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, Josh Friedman, and Shane Salerno, all competent screenwriters of their own regard. According to a Variety interview with Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, Cameron shared nearly 800 pages worth of notes with the gang, a Pandorapedia, in order to get everyone on the same page. Notes that were all his dreams and thoughts about different Na'vi worlds and possibilities of all these characters and creatures, according to Silver. And these notes were unorganized. This meeting of screenwriters was meant to straighten them out. The writer's room worked together to set down the general trajectory of all Avatar sequels and map out the grand scope scheme of things together. And they did that for around 6 months, before Cameron finally assigned each a movie of his own and sent them on their separate ways. Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, the screenwriting couple, were tasked with writing The Way of Water, which Cameron later decided to split into 2 movies because of its sheer size. And obviously, Cameron was supervising the scripts the whole time and making changes here and there. By the end of it, Cameron estimated in an interview that the script had taken 4 years to write overall. It's clear that a lot of work went into writing Avatar. In other interviews, Cameron talks about how he pushed himself and his writers to try and figure out what made the first Avatar such a hit. In his own words, we must crack the code of what the hell happened. For some reason, however, despite this passion and immense hard work, there seems to have been an odd lack of oversight or scrutinous supervision in spots. Maybe it was the hectic writing process and the necessity for Cameron to supervise 3 scripts simultaneously. Maybe that's why some core plot element mishaps went unnoticed. It, however, cannot be denied that that was indeed the case. The Way of Water's main plot is built upon flawed foundations. Early on in the movie, the humans' return to Pandora is established. This time, however, their goal is not to obtain unobtainium, but rather to colonize Pandora, as we learn that the Earth is near uninhabitable. In order to colonize Pandora, the RDA wishes to deal with the Na'vi insurrection once and for all, and thus have cloned Quaritch and his men into Na'vi bodies, as the only way for the RDA to bypass the forest's natural defense mechanisms and get to the Omaticaya clan is to use Na'vi bodies. So we learn very early on in the movie that essentially the RDA's intention is to colonize Pandora. That is their main goal. The Na'vi stand in the way of them doing that, so they must deal with them first. But their overall goal is to colonize Pandora. However, the plot we actually follow ends up becoming a revenge plot, as Quaritch does his all to find and kill Jake Sully and his family. Now you might be thinking, yeah, exactly. If he kills Jake Sully, he'll end the Na'vi opposition. But that is simply not true. The Na'vi have been opposed to the humans' colonialist efforts since way before Jake led them in the first film. They are warriors, and there are countless of their clans spread throughout the world, each with their own leaders. Killing Jake Sully would discourage them and would deal a big blow, but it's still not going to change the fact that the Na'vi will still resist the humans, and that at this point in time, Jake has given them enough information, experience, and human technology to be able to pose a real threat to the humans when they come. Jake Sully then flees with his family, and Quaritch and the RDA abandon their plans against the Omaticaya to pursue him. The whole point of bringing Quaritch and his men back as recombinants is their Na'vi ability to bypass Awa's natural defense mechanisms. The forest regards them as Na'vi and allows them to pass, but had been stopping the humans whenever they tried before. The opportunity for Quaritch and his men to infiltrate or attack the Omaticaya is all abandoned, and the sole focus becomes to find Jake Sully wherever he is. The RDA's new commanding general, Francis Ardmore, is totally okay allowing Quaritch to pursue his revenge fantasy, and disregards the initial plan, which is dealing with the Na'vi in general in order to colonize the planet. If General Ardmore wanted to accomplish the RDA's goals on Pandora, she would have continued the assault attempts on the Omaticaya, regardless of Jake leaving. In fact, the RDA continuing to pursue their original goal, the goal of ending the Na'vi, would have helped them get Jake Sully back. It would have been incredibly simple for the RDA to continue their assault on the Na'vi, even if it would take time, because this assault would force Jake to come back to face them. Jake's departure, logically, should accomplish nothing, because it wouldn't protect his fellow Na'vi, but rather put them in more danger as potential hostages or bait, or at the very least, a less defended clan who is an easier target for the RDA. Because at the end of the day, the humans' problem isn't with Jake Sully, it's with the thousands of Na'vi who have spurned human rule long before Jake came to rally them against it. Jake is a vital cog in that machine, but he is not the end-all be-all. It's not like the Na'vi were willing to be colonized before he came along. In short, the trajectory that the plot instead ends up taking ignores pre-established RDA intentions. Even pursuing the RDA's distorted goal of capturing Jake is done clumsily and in an overly complicated fashion, which ignores the simplest, most sensical routes that the movie itself introduces at its beginning. From a storytelling perspective, the problem that brings about all these plot holes in The Way of Water is how the story handles intention and obstacle. In his screenwriting masterclass, Aaron Sorkin, the screenwriter behind The Social Network, A Few Good Men, Steve Jobs, and many more, explains in one of his first lessons the concept of intention and obstacle. And irrelevant of what I think of Sorkin and his work, this lesson in particular made a lot of sense and was one of the few that really stuck with me. In brief, Sorkin explains that to tell a story, you need to have intention and obstacle. The intention is basically when, in your story, someone wants something. The obstacle is when something is standing in the way of that someone getting that something. Sorkin believes that in order to write a good story, that intention must be very solid. Someone wants something, and they want it bad. On the other hand, the obstacle needs to be formidable as well. So, whatever is standing in the way of that someone getting that something must be incredibly solid as well, and do its best to stop them. Sorkin explains that the way to ensure that both your intention and your obstacle are strong enough is by pressing on them. You keep pressing the intention until it's urgent and solid enough that it really grabs someone's attention and is gripping enough to create drama. You also keep pressing on the obstacle to ensure that there are no holes in it and that it's strong enough to stand in the way of that intention. So, let's say I'm trying to tell a story about a knight who wishes to rescue a princess from a dragon's lair. Simple, right? The intention here is the knight's. He wants to rescue the princess. I can press on that intention by explaining through my story that this dragon has been torturing and eating princesses by the dozen. He barely keeps them around for a couple of days before chowing down on them. There, I've introduced urgency. I can press the intention even more by making that princess out to be the knight's lover, which he loves more than anything and would do anything for. We can press on it even more. The princess's father, the king, has vowed that if the knight is not successful, he will punish his family for it. That's even more urgency, more drama, and higher stakes. There's no way out of it. The knight has to go and save the princess. Now, the main obstacle in the way here is the dragon. The dragon is the threat that is stopping the knight from saving the princess. Okay, so why can't the knight gather an army and march upon the dragon's lair? Surely the king would spare every expense in order to save his daughter. Okay, so that's a possible hole I need to clog. Let's say the king can't spare any soldiers because every able-bodied man is already off fighting in the war, and any that remained behind would be more of a hassle to the knight rather than an aid. Okay, well, why can't the knight sneak the princess out when the dragon is off hunting for the day? Well, let's say he can't because he's simply not fast enough or smart enough to accomplish a tactical rescue like that. Fine, well, why can't the princess escape on her own when the dragon is away and meet up with the knight? Surely she knows he's coming since he's in love with her. Shouldn't it be easier for her since she's theoretically already seen the paths of the lair when the dragon had brought her in? Well, she still can't because the lair itself is overrun with undead guards that would kill her on sight if they caught her, or just end up returning her to prison. That's what Aaron Sorkin means by pressing on an obstacle. You need to make it impervious and nigh unbreakable, and you need to show that strength to the audience. Going back to Avatar, we can clearly see the human antagonist's main intention. They intend on taking over Pandora. The intention is strong and urgent because we know that the Earth is dying and is almost uninhabitable. Okay, we're good on that regard. The intention is decently strong. However, the issue arises with the obstacle. The obstacle that stands in the way of the humans' intention is the Na'vi, the Omaticaya clan in particular, at least as a start. Now, this obstacle only seems to weaken as the plot goes on. First, the recombinants are introduced and are shown to be capable of entering the forest without suffering the wrath of Awa. Second, Jake Sully leaves with his family, thus leaving the Na'vi with a less experienced leader. Essentially, these conditions are the best the RDA has ever had in their fight against the Na'vi in recent memory. What this means is that we have a weak, relatively easy to overcome obstacle. But what the movie does here to strengthen its obstacle is simply to change it. Instead of the Na'vi opposition in general, the obstacle becomes Jake Sully. This new obstacle is stronger because Jake ends up leaving the forest and going very far away. But it's not really the actual obstacle that stands in the way of the RDA's initial intention, colonizing Pandora. Subsequently, the initial intention is dropped, and we barely hear any mention of the RDA's colonialist plans on Pandora for the rest of the movie. While Quaritch is free to expend RDA resources in his pursuit of Sully blood, while Commanding General Ardmore seems to have no issue with letting this presumably very expensive, very hard to acquire task force ignore the whole purpose they were initially summoned to fulfill. Additionally, the new obstacle isn't all that strong itself either, because it'd be very easy to get Jake to return simply by harassing the Omaticaya in the forest. Essentially, the movie does not press on its obstacles. The change in the antagonist's obstacle and the soon-to-follow convenient dismissal of their original intention feels fabricated as is, and makes the plot's stakes drop considerably, as we no longer feel like the Omaticaya are threatened. Moreover, the second introduced obstacle also carries no sense of urgency for a big chunk of the movie, as Quaritch and his crew dawdle instead of utilizing the relatively easy solution of assaulting the Omaticaya to draw Jake out. As a viewer, when you can clearly see that something the movie is trying to make you believe is difficult can actually be easily accomplished in obvious, unmentioned ways, it becomes hard for that movie to build tension and suspense, because the problem that it's posing appears to have a simple answer. It's basically saying, "Drats, how will the knight ever defeat the dragon on his own?" without explaining, or at least implying, why the knight couldn't actually go and gather some of the king's soldiers to help him along the way. It's going to be hard for you to feel for the knight and for the story to grip you with suspense and tension when you spend the whole movie thinking, why the hell is this guy going at this alone? Why didn't he just gather some other people to help? Why didn't the princess just escape on her own? Why? It stretches the limits of suspension of disbelief too much to stick. I know this is kind of a simple example, but I hope it's at least getting my point across clearly. I also realize that within the context of Avatar, I'm looking at intention and obstacle from the antagonist's point of view. But either way, it still applies in the general scheme of things when you want to make the antagonist's goals and their methods of pursuing them believable. To return to our original point, if you're someone who really cares about plot, this foundational plot hole on the level of the movie's obstacle breaks the tension of the story and throws you out of it. It breaks immersion. And while to me, that was the most egregious of the movie's plot fumbles, it wasn't its only one. Another widely discussed plot hole refers to the random disappearance of the entire Metkaina Na'vi clan midway through the final fight with Quaritch and the Recombinants. They're there and then suddenly they're not, even though the fight is still raging on and the chief's own daughter is there in the action. It baffles me how such a huge amount of care and detail can be put into a movie of this huge a scale, but that plot holes like these still manage to slip through the cracks. And I know it's something not everyone really cares about or minds. A lot of people are content with the experience. That's why they come to see this movie, for that cinematic experience. And sometimes a few plot holes in the road don't matter much. It's a sentiment I've seen shared frequently around the internet, and a completely understandable one at that. But to me, these issues strike me as particularly impactful when James Cameron himself is constantly stressing how important it is for him to tell a story, how the heart and the characters of the movie are what matters most. According to Variety's interview with the screenwriters, the common thread throughout the writing process, they say, was Cameron's commitment not just to the anthropological fidelity of the world of Pandora, but to the deeply felt human, Na'vi story at its center. If there is this much attention and emotion put into this human story, then the same respect and caution should be put into the overall framework that facilitates this deep emotional story and the characters that inhabit it. Or else the emotional character story will stumble upon the wreckage of the overarching narrative foundations that hold it. Now, let's circle back to an aspect of the Avatar movies that is for the most part well regarded and respected. Ever since Avatar came out all the way back in 2009, it's been evident that James Cameron is really passionate about this franchise. Besides the overall dedication, hard work, and years of effort he's put into it, Cameron seems to really just love this idea, this world that he created. All the way back in 1994, years before the technology would advance enough for Cameron to start making these movies, Cameron wrote an 80-page treatment for the film. In 2005, he started developing an actual language for the Na'vi. A whole-ass book was made and published in 2009 as a 224-page field guide to Pandora, with loads of world building and lore about the planet. In addition to, more recently, two 128-page visual dictionary tie-in books for The Way of Water. Cameron even wanted to write a prequel novel and eventually ended up hiring a writer to write 4. If one thing is clear about the Avatar franchise as a whole, it's that James Cameron is near obsessed with it. The man is infinitely passionate about this work of his and has been doing the utmost at all times to bring across his vision of this fictional world and setting in the best way possible, pouring hours upon hours into world building. Don't forget the 800 pages of notes, the Pandorapedia he shared with his writer's room in preparation to write the sequels. Cameron is an incredibly passionate world builder. He really cares about expanding and exploring Pandora and making it into this living, breathing thing, and so much work has been put into doing just that. And even though this world that he's creating and developing may not be all that original or new, one can't deny the amount of passion that doing all of this must have required. Obviously, Cameron isn't content just building out this world all to himself. He wants to share it with us as the audience throughout his movies. He wants to show us the majestic creatures that inhabit Pandora, the fascinating wildlife, the rich cultures and traditions of the Na'vi clans. And it's mostly interesting stuff, but it's not always relevant. Now, usually, if you want to tell a traditional, straightforward story similar to the ones that Cameron tells, you usually avoid bloating that story with additional details that may not be completely relevant to your main narrative. Obviously, there's still room for world building, for expanding your setting and fleshing out your characters and making everything realer by providing small, sometimes seemingly innocuous information which ultimately aids in giving your characters and setting an added layer of depth. However, some of writing's most common best practices promote the removal of excess, unnecessary information from your story. Things that are irrelevant to your main plot or that serve little purpose in the overarching narrative may distract from that main narrative and skew the pacing of the story in a way that reduces from its impact, or possibly in a way that might lose that audience if you spend too much time on things that are ultimately irrelevant to the story you've already gotten them invested in. So, to reiterate, there should almost always be room for world building in your story, but it should never take such a front row seat that it takes away from your overarching narrative, especially if that world building relies on details that may be irrelevant to your core story. An expert storyteller can build and flesh out his world with details that not only make his settings and characters more three-dimensional, but also, in a way, tie back into the main plot. In the Avatar movies, Cameron's world building isn't useless or irrelevant. Amongst other things, it plays a role in highlighting the environmental themes of the movie, particularly through showing us Pandora and its deep biodiversity and fascinating ecosystems. In The Way of Water, we see Jake's children explore the seas and the fascinating flora and fauna that inhabit it. A big chunk of the middle part of this movie centers on that, but it's a big chunk of an already long movie. And while it's an interesting extended look into what Pandora has to offer, it's not completely relevant to the main story. Yes, it's relevant in strengthening the environmental themes of the movie, and that warrants its presence, but not to this extent. Even people who really enjoyed this movie seem to agree that there is some dispensable padding here. There is some extra fat that could have been cut off. Narratively, it's not enough to warrant such a strong focus and this extended presence. In The Way of Water, it can sometimes feel like more effort has been put into these world-building scenes than has been put into the main story. And again, these scenes have their value and things like this should be included, but not this much. In its current state, it can get overbearing at times, and the movie can start making you feel like you're watching a nature documentary as opposed to a movie. And I think that isn't really part of your traditional movie experience. It's not really what people think of when they come see a movie. Extended sequences of water exploration and discovery in Pandora are mildly fun and interesting, but I don't feel like they are that crucial to this film, and thus lose their interest and charm after a while. Sure, it could be nice as a fictional documentary of Pandora, some extended Pandoran lore special, but within the context of the movie, it overstays its welcome, at least for me. Personally, I need to be sold on this franchise before I'm interested enough to be enjoying such extended pieces of world building, and even then my interest will wane the more I feel like these eye candy sequences stray further away from the main story. Basically, I'm not there to see Cameron build this fictional world primarily. I'm there to see him tell a story, and if he builds his world along the way, all the better, but that world building should never take away from the story. With this situation, we're treading back to the matter of personal preference as far as film viewing. Many people share views that are directly opposite to mine. To them, the main draw of these movies is Pandora itself and the world building that goes into it. That is the main attraction, and it makes up for any shortcomings in the actual narrative. Naturally, people who are interested in visuals will enjoy the world building sequences because they are a beauty to behold and truly a spectacle from that perspective. But those who are there for a story may find these portions of the movie lacking. Besides feeling like they are lacking in relevance to plot, another issue that these visual world-building sections raise is that they can very easily break the flow of the movie. From a pacing perspective, if we're analyzing the story within the scope of the 3-act structure, the movie dawdles in the 2nd act. It feels like it lulls there for so long that the urgency of the movie's dramatic question, the main problem Jake Sully and his family faces at the beginning of the movie, loses its momentum. These people are supposed to be on the run from Quaritch and his men, who in the meanwhile should be hot on their tail. But you kind of forget that that's what's happening as you start settling into normal life with the Metcaina clan. You stop worrying about Quaritch catching up to them and about whether they're going to survive or not. This 2nd act is the rising action. It's Jake and his family's first attempt at solving their issue, primarily through evading Quaritch and joining the Water clan, but subsequently finding themselves faced with other issues. However, these other issues that Jake and his family face can feel minuscule in comparison. Mainly, these are problems settling into their new home and the tensions that rise between Jake's children and the children of the Metcaina clan leader Tonowari. They're interesting problems of their own right, but they don't compare in stake to the threat of humanity coming back to colonize Pandora, and to the vengeful wrath of Quaritch coming to kill Jake and his entire family. There's just a lot of downtime before the action starts rising again as Quaritch starts threatening and harming other water clans for Jake's location, so much that the act feels more like a very slowly getting up action as opposed to a rising action. You spend so much time with these relatively minor side plots and the exploration of the clan and the sea that the action feels like it halts entirely. When Quaritch finally starts making progress again, it's almost surprising, and the movie needs to start rebuilding momentum all over again. It just makes the 1st and 3rd act feel incredibly spaced apart. In addition, the messy pacing detracts from opportunities for character development. The movie juggles a lot of characters, but not all of them get their fair share in the spotlight. Normally that's fine, it's normal. Movies don't always get the runtime that they need to fit in everything. But we know that Avatar did. It just chose to use it elsewhere, on general aesthetics and world building. Subsequently, we barely get to know Neteyam, Jake's eldest child. He barely gets any time alone in the spotlight, and we mostly only see him when he's accompanying his brother Loak and trying to keep him in check. We get a very basic impression of who he is, making him a two-dimensional, responsible older brother stereotype. When he dies towards the end of the movie, it's hard to really be impacted by his death or to feel for him. It's hard to be sad for a character that was barely developed and that I barely had any time to get attached to. Sure, the scene still kind of succeeds in being emotional because you feel for the characters around him. The characters who you know more about and are thus subsequently more inclined to like, such as Jake and Loak and Neytiri. But the scene only affected me in regards to them and not to Neteyam. He hadn't left any lasting impressions on me, so I was indifferent to whether he made it through or not. I believe that if some of that world-building time had instead been lent to putting Neteyam in the spotlight, it would have made for a much more impactful death, one that would really drive home the loss that Jake and Neytiri felt, that would really help us relate to Neytiri's wild, chaotic rage that came after, and that would make that scene where Jake relives that moment that he spent with his son years before so much more emotional. I do understand that Neteyam's death was most likely done to serve the trajectory of Loak and Jake's growths and the growth of their relationship, but his prior underuse makes it come off like he was killed simply because he was the easiest option, the most expendable, ignoring Took, of course. course. That could have been avoided with a little less Pandora and a bit more Nitteum. And given that Cameron stresses how much he values a deep, emotional character story, it would have been in line with his vision to sacrifice some of that world-building time to enrich one of his central characters. I'm going to talk about one more thing concerning Avatar's writing. This one isn't much of a point of argument. I don't really think there's two sides to the coin. It's just an issue with the Way of Water in particular that really aggravated me. It is, in fact, my biggest problem with the movie. But before I get to that, I just want to mention that if you're still watching, thanks, I appreciate ya. My biggest issue with Avatar: The Way of Water is that it is nearly identical to the first Avatar. And no, this is not an exaggeration. It is practically the same movie. But before we all start losing our minds, let me explain. I mentioned earlier on in the video that I only got around to seeing 2009's Avatar one day before I saw The Way of Water. A lot of other people rewatched Avatar before seeing the sequel, but me, my first ever experience with the franchise was the day before I saw its sequel. And obviously, it sucks that I hadn't seen it before, but at the same time, seeing it then had two advantages. First, it allowed me to go into the sequel without any nostalgia goggles, without an opinion colored by a pleasurable, extra impressive viewing experience from my youth. Second, it allowed me to go into The Way of Water with a fresh, rock-solid impression of what the first Avatar was, given that it was so sharply imprinted in my mind after a very recent viewing. And the thing is, I actually enjoyed Avatar, even though I did not expect to. I had a negative disposition to it because of all I'd seen online, all the memes, all the conversations about its lack of cultural impact, all the people clamoring about its undeserved spot as the highest grossing movie of all time. But yeah, surprisingly, I enjoyed it. It was simple and straightforward, which is not what I usually look for in a movie story, but it was well executed and beautiful, and it was a fascinating piece of science fiction. I didn't go absolutely crazy over it, I wasn't in love head over heels, but I enjoyed my experience with the film. It was good. Now, imagine my disappointment as I'm watching The Way of Water and I keep seeing familiar plot beats one after the other, until I quickly realize that most of them are ripped straight out of the first movie, almost identically. The introduction brings back the humans and reintroduces Quaritch in his spanking new Avatar body. Things are going slow, but relatively different until Jake decides to escape to the Metcaina, the water clan. As soon as he arrives there, we start replaying Avatar 1. Just like in the first movie, Jake is an outsider amidst a foreign people. He tries to learn their ways and adapt to them. One of the clan's leaders kind of accepts him while the other is apprehensive. Meanwhile, a human threat looms in the distance. Inadvertently, Jake causes the human threat to come with fire and blood to the Na'vi people. In the first movie, because he's initially a double agent aiding the humans in their search for unobtainium. In the second movie, because he's running away and doesn't realize that the humans will follow him either way. Just like the Omaticaya, where when the humans came to attack the Tree of Life, the Metcaina are upset with Jake and blame him for the coming of the humans, but eventually allow him to help. Jake admits responsibility, gathers a force of Na'vi, and faces against the humans. He confronts Quaritch in a deadly final battle where he initially hesitates but then goes into it. The fight ends with Quaritch's presumed death. Someone very close to Jake has died and everyone is sad. The Na'vi gather to perform a ritual to connect to Eywa in their honor. Jake accepts his new place amongst the Na'vi as he fully integrates into the clan. This is now his home. The end. The general outline of the movie is exactly the same, except The Way of Water takes place in the water as opposed to the forest, and it highlights the theme of family and supplements its events with more characters and thus more perspectives. But within the general scope of things, nothing really changes. It's no longer an issue of a simple story. A simple story was fine. It was fine in 2009's Avatar because it was decently executed. But to repeat the exact same thing in Avatar 2 is incredulous. We must crack the code of what the hell happened, Cameron told his writer's room when they were preparing to write the sequels, pushing them to try and find out what made the first movie such a hit. But it seems that the result to that was that in order to replicate the success of the first, Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, under Cameron's supervision, rewrote the same movie. And I find this particularly bewildering, given that Cameron himself said during an interview with IGN, "I guarantee you won't be able to predict it. What people hate the most is to go and see a movie and say, oh, predictable. This is not predictable, I don't think. I defy anybody to predict where the story goes." Cameron even threw out his first script for The Way of Water because he said he thought it didn't go enough into the unexpected, which to him is one of the most critical elements of sequels. So why is The Way of Water so similar to its predecessor? I wish I could understand what Cameron means, or why he said what he said, but at this point, I'm lost. And to me, his statements about the sequel being unpredictable clash with his writing style, which is meant to tackle real, universal human themes that everyone can relate to. And his method of doing that before has been simple and straightforward, instead of twisty and unpredictable. But either way, as you've probably heard by now, whatever Cameron's thought process was, whatever path he ultimately decided to take Avatar, it worked. The movie succeeded. It made the massive money it had to make in order to guarantee that its sequels get made. I didn't even see a single reviewer cite the similarities between the two movies. In fact, most reviewers I follow seem to like the movie and consider it a good successor that improved upon the first. But, as has always been the case with Avatar, there are almost as many people that like this franchise as there are people that don't. But disagreement spurs discussion, and discussion brings about attention, and attention spawns curiosity, and that usually translates into more movie tickets sold and more financial success for the movie. That's just how things are, and it works for Avatar. I hope that in this deep dive of sorts, I managed to highlight Avatar's main points of contention for critics and audiences alike. It's been fascinating seeing how some of the things people feel so positively about in these movies somehow end up being what others truly dislike most about it. And I hope I managed to point those factors out clearly and give both sides their due, while showing you my own perspective on the matter along the way. I hope you'll let me know your thoughts about Avatar in the comments below. Which side of this spectrum are you on? Do you like Avatar? Do you dislike it? Are you indifferent, and why? What did I miss in this long-ass video, and what did I get wrong? Did you guys also notice how similar Avatar: The Way of Water was to Avatar 1? Please say yes so that I may maintain my sanity, please. No, but seriously, do let me know what you thought about everything. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it all the way here. I truly cannot express in words how thankful I am for you if you have. Writing this video took a tremendous amount of time and effort. I was really sick for a while in December after seeing the movie, and then I was extremely demotivated, and then I was extremely busy. But if you're watching this right now, then it means I managed to push through and finish this video after all. So yeah, I really appreciate you dedicating so much of your valuable time to watching it. And given that I'm finishing writing this in 2023, even though I might be releasing this late in January, Happy New Year! Thank you so much for 3,000 plus subscribers. More people keep pouring in, and I'm truly so thankful. Hopefully 2023 will be good for us, and I'll be able to put out a lot more content at a much more consistent rate. You guys' likes, comments, and support are always a big help, so thanks again. But anyways, I've rambled on for far too long now. That's it for this video. Take care, and I'll hopefully see you soon. Goodbye.